Becoming a Bible Nerd. This is chapter 21. If you stuck with us through this is the last chapter. It's a fun chapter and I'm excited to get digging in with you, and it's going to be short, so you'll be in and out of here in no time. We're just going to really just talk about the highlights of this chapter. It is so fun. As we know, Jesus, after his resurrection, starts appearing to different people, and it's going to be the third time in this gospel that we see him appear. It says that he appears on the Sea of Tiberias. Now, this is the Sea of Galilee, and if you're wondering why John calls it Tiberias, remember John writes this decades later. It's at the end of his life. He's an old man. So much has happened in the world, and so now the sea has been renamed. It's not Galilee anymore. It is called the Sea of Tiberias. So to the modern readers, they would know exactly where this was. And we know that Peter, Thomas, Nathaniel, James, John, and two others, I wonder why those two don't get to be named. Maybe John just had a moment, a senior moment. He couldn't remember their names, but we know that all these men were there, and Peter goes out fishing, and they all decide to follow. Now, something interesting that caught my eye, and with that, one of my commentaries that I used mentioned it, but that Peter almost like lost his vision. Jesus had prepared all of these men. It wasn't always clear. It's like that they were seeing and hearing it in pieces without complete understanding. But Jesus all along was preparing them for what was to come and what their role was after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And he had taught this. And we can read in Matthew some of his teachings to prepare them to know what to do next. But most of them lost their vision. They lost their way. They didn't know what to do during this time. And so they go back to what they know. And for Peter, that's fishing. And so he goes back to what he knows best. But the interesting thing is when they do that, the result is in catching nothing. They weren't fruitful in what they were doing. They did not catch a single fish when they tried to do things on their own. So we see that Jesus comes along the shore, and it's one of those times that he's not recognizable. And he ends up speaking to them, and suddenly their nets are full when they obey him. When we obey, that's when God brings the increase. So we can do things that we are good at and that we've known how to do with our own hands, and it can produce nothing. Maybe you really are catching the fish, but it's not doing anything in the spiritual sense. But then we can do things through obedience, and it's God who brings the increase just through the obedience. And so I'm going to read verses 5 through 7 in this section. It's Jesus said, "Men," Jesus called to them, "You don't have any fish, do you?" "No," they answered. "Well, cast your net on the right side of the boat." He told them, "And you'll find some." So they did, and they were unable to haul it in because of the large amount of fish. Therefore, the disciple, the one who Jesus loved, said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And that's when they knew, when they saw the miracle. And I love this. It says that when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he tied his outer garments around his waist and plunged into the sea. Since they were not far from the land, about 100 yards, the other disciples came in by boat, dragging the full net with them. When they got to the land, they saw charcoal there with fish laying on it and bread. But I love Peter's response. He jumped out of the boat and he was getting to Jesus as fast as he possibly could. Now, one of the things that's happening here is we talked about they've already lost their vision, they lost their way. It's almost like they forgot all that Jesus had told them, and they're going to go back to fishing. So Jesus does a little illustration here. When they get to the shore, they see a charcoal fire, and they see fish lying there, and they see bread. And that is going to remind them of him feeding the 4,000 and him feeding the 5,000, and it's going to help them recall his provision for it. It also ends up saying how many fish that they caught, and there's many theories on what the 153 mean, but what we really know is the more details of a situation that these gospel writers would include would allow the audience to know that they truly were an eyewitness. And so it could have just been for credibility. But this time, Jesus is going to do something else. He has the fish and he has the bread, but then he also tells them to bring the fish that they caught. And so basically, he's now not just providing something out of nothing, but he is asking them to partake in something. He told them where to fish and how to do it, and then they brought in a huge amount, and he's asking them to bring that to the fire. And so this time Jesus is providing, but through their labor. And so that is a message to all of us, that sometimes we can have our hands in something, you don't feel like you're producing anything, but when we walk in obedience, and God might be calling you to do something completely out of your comfort zone that you think, how on earth is this going to be fruitful? I don't even know what I'm doing. But that's the beauty of this whole gospel, is that when we operate in obedience, it's God who brings the increase, and he honors our labor, and it's him who gets the glory, because then you can say, I don't even know how this happened, but God made it happen. And so we don't rely on our own selves. We don't allow ourselves to get glorified, but he gets the glory and the light shines through us. He tells them to come and dine, and he's about to have a hard conversation with Peter. And so what we see here is that he's caring for their physical needs before he has a talk about their spiritual needs. And I think that that's a good lesson for us to learn as we disciple others. Bring them in, let them sit around your table, meet needs of other people, and then have difficult talks with them, because they know at that point that you're doing it out of love and not out of being judgy. And so we need to meet physical needs sometimes before having spiritual needs met. So Jesus and Peter have a very interesting conversation. Now, Jesus is going to ask Peter if he loves him 3 times. 3 times Jesus is going to declare his love back. In the Greek, Jesus asked Peter, do you agape me? And Peter is going to answer back, Jesus, you know I phileo you. These are 2 different words for love in the Greek language. Agape is total commitment and selfless love, the type of love God has for us. And phileo, I might be saying this wrong, but philo, that is the term for brotherly love. Now, most of the commentaries I read, I tried to check 3 of them, they all said, don't focus on that. In these ancient letters, this was a writing style that was very common, just, I guess, so it wouldn't be just using the same word over and over again. They would switch it out, and those 2 words could be used interchangeably. There's other theories that Jesus was saying, do you love me unconditionally? And Peter was saying, I couldn't love you that much, but I love you this. I mean, the scholars that I studied said, just forget about reading something into that. But what we're going to focus on today is that Jesus asked him 3 times, do you love me? And 3 times Peter answers back, yes. Now, what does this remind you of? 3 times Peter confessing something. So we know a couple of chapters ago, he confessed 3 times that he did not know Jesus. And so this is like a reversal of his denial. He's confessing his love now, where before he denied that he knew Jesus. And God does this all through scriptures, where we see a reversal of someone's sin, and now there's a picture of them doing something else that would be the opposite of that. So I thought that was neat. But in every question, Jesus comes back and says, if you love me, feed my sheep, or he says, feed my lambs, shepherd my sheep, feed my sheep. Now, the interesting thing here is that Peter is a fisherman. And from the beginning of the Gospels, we see that he is called to be a fisher of men. That means to draw people in. And we typically recognize that as evangelism, which going out and telling people about Jesus is way different. The role of an evangelist is way different than the role of a pastor or a shepherd. But here we have Jesus taking Peter, the evangelist, and saying, now I want you to move into this new role, and I want you to be a shepherd. I'm leaving. I was the good shepherd. Remember, we had a whole chapter on that Jesus was the good shepherd, and he's basically passing that baton to Peter. He's naming Peter as that rock that he's going to build his church on. So that is what he is calling him to do. So then they have an interesting conversation after that. So starting in verse 18, Jesus says, I assure you, when you were young, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will be stretched let me reread. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will tie you and carry you where you don't want to go. He said this to signify what kind of death he would glorify God. And after saying this, he told him, follow me. So we know through ancient texts that the tradition has that Peter was crucified upside down in Rome under Nero in 64 AD. Nero was the ruler at the time, and he was absolutely insane. And he would tie Christians to big stakes and light them on fire and tell people that he was the light of the world. And he was just a horrible man. And we believe that Peter was crucified, that he was stretched out and tied up and crucified upside down and martyred for his work in spreading the early church. But he looks at Peter and it says, follow me. He's charging him that even though you know that this is going to end badly, I challenge you to follow me. So this is where we see, I think so many of us can relate with Peter because it's such human nature. He's not this perfect saint that is flawless, but he is just a rugged, rough man that has all the thoughts that we have, but he lets those thoughts come out of his mouth, and he's so relatable. So Peter turned around and saw the disciple Jesus loved was following them. So basically John was sitting there following him. This disciple was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and asked, Lord, who is it that's going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? Now remember, these guys are young. John is probably around 14, 15, 16 during this time. Peter's the oldest of the disciples, but he's still in his early 20s. And he wants to know, well, God, if I have to go through this, what is one of my best friends going to have to endure? Is he going to have to endure something bad too? If I want him to remain until I come, Jesus answered, what is that to you? And he says again, as for you, Peter, follow me. So this report was spread to the brothers that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not tell him that he wouldn't die, but if I wanted him to remain till I come, what would be that to you? And we do believe that John was never martyred for the gospel's sake. We know that he lived for an old age, and we know that he did work in Ephesus, and he was exiled to the island of Patmos where he wrote Revelation. And I just sometimes, what I see through this, and I'm no scholar, but that although John did mighty things for the kingdom, Peter was set apart from the beginning before Jesus ever died on the cross to be that foundation for the early church, that he said that he would build his church upon this rock. And sometimes with a greater task and a greater burden of leadership comes harder things to walk through. And so that's just the price that we have to pay sometimes for the calling on our life. And we cannot compare ourselves to the next person because each of our callings are different. And I'm just going to close today. Actually, I wanted to mention the Jewish New Testament commentary talks about this, and I thought it was so good, at least for me. While God created us to wonder, he wants us to wonder. He wants us to wonder how the world works and what the text means, and he wants us to wonder about him and life. And that's how there's discoveries and inventions and great things for the world, because he created the human mind to do that. He does not want us to concern ourselves with wonder about other people and comparing ourselves against them, against their gifts, their talents, their interests, their accomplishments. He just wants us to be us and who he created us to be and follow him with reckless obedience. So John ends up closing out his gospel with this. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that the whole world itself couldn't contain a book that it would be written in. And that is how he concludes his gospel. This has been such a fun adventure with you guys. I hope you are able to to have grown in your relationship with God, to see who Jesus was and the work that he did on the cross more clearly. And then I just hope along the way that there were these truths that God spoke to you, and I hope that you know him a little bit better. This has been fun. Thank you for doing it with me. Until next time, happy reading.